we welcome you all. I would like to introduce, without further ado, Eric Goldschmidt, world champion glassblower. Eric is known as the glass string man, the golden glass string man. Eric has one string of glass around his middle and one around his step back there. Son, you're drawing flies. Eric rolls that simple steel drum, heating the glass with a 4,000 degree oxygen and propane torch, spinning this glass into threads finer than the human hair. He can easily break this flexible thread with his hands. This is akin to the process that we all use today to communicate, called fiber optics. Thank you, Dr. Goldschmidt. I would like to introduce one of our star librarians, direct from the Raycow Research Library. Rebecca Hopman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. We are so excited to share with you our modern take on an itinerant glassworker performance. But first, I'd like to preface all of that with a bit of a historical overview of this tradition. So, what is an itinerant glassworker? These are lamp workers or flame workers who traveled around from town to town, entertaining and educating their audiences with demonstrations and beautiful displays of glass like those you see before you tonight. Itinerant glassworkers were active for over 300 years, demonstrating to people of all social classes around the world. These are some of the images that we have of itinerant glassworkers, from some of the very earliest advertisements to the flame workers at the museum who carry on our tradition of demonstration today. Our stars for the evening, at least for the historical part of this talk, are Charles Woodruff, Nora Allen, Grace Howell, and their families. The Woodruffs, Allens, and Howells all participated in key moments of the itinerant glassworker trade. So I'd like to highlight their stories as we look at this history of the profession. These are some of the earliest known itinerant glassworker advertisements. The one in black and white is from England, and the one in color is from Poland. Both are from the mid to late 1600s. These ads establish many of the elements that remain key to itinerant glassworker performances for the next 300 plus years. These include demonstrations like the glass spinning you just saw, Cartesian divers or bottle imps and other scientific experiments, and displays of beautiful glass that audiences could purchase or sometimes receive free with the price of admission. They boast, just like Mr. Gibbs and Mr. Goldschmidt, of being able to spin glass finer than the hair of the head with a wheel that spins 10,000 yards of glass in less than half an hour. Their Cartesian divers aren't explained through science, as you might expect, but in magical terms, where the lampworker controls the figurines in up to 4 different languages, commanding them to move up and down in the bottle. When, as you can see here, they're actually being moved up and down by the pressure of the hand pressing down against the rubber at the top of the tube. We're going to jump ahead about 100 years to when we have a lot more information about these itinerant glassworkers and their demonstrations. In the early 1800s, itinerant glassworkers were becoming popular across Europe, including England, where all of these advertisements are from. They performed in cities like Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Brighton, Bath, and London, as well as many smaller towns and cities. These lampworkers included large models of famous ships or bridges in their shows, and some, like Mr. Scott, who's featured in the center here, had even more spectacular displays. In his case, he had a hydraulic skeleton on display, which he said is kept in continual motion by itself, showing how the blood passes through the different channels of the human frame. Mr. Scott was lucky in that he had some pretty important patrons, namely the future Queen Victoria and her mother. In 1819, James Tilley boards a ship in England for the United States. He is the first known itinerant glassworker to demonstrate in North America. His show included things like a hydropneumatic fountain, a Cartesian diver, and many other delights. About a decade later, he's joined by Lawrence Finn, who demonstrates up and down the country in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New Orleans. Finn, in an example followed by later lampworkers, also spends some of his time demonstrating in museums, like Barnum's American Museum and Peale's Museum in New York City. So the tradition of lampworking demonstrations in museums goes a way, way longer back than I would have ever expected. These spots in museums have a guaranteed audience, so Finn doesn't need to spend his time and money gathering his own crowd. Soon, American-born glassworkers join the profession, and they post advertisements like these on town notice boards and hand them out to passerby. Some of them begin to emphasize the scientific nature of their show, responding to the growing interest audiences have in learning about science and technology. Professors Matthew and Owen take this marketing one step further. Neither of them had a PhD, but they called themselves professors to associate their shows with knowledge and respectability. Owen, playing on this theme, includes a lecture on natural philosophy, what today we would consider science, illustrated by practical experiments. As the 1850s approach, a new group enters the scene, the Brothers Woodruff. George, Charles, and William Woodruff are three brothers born and raised in Boston, who, while still in their teens, decide to form an itinerant glassworker troupe. Their innovations have a lasting impact on the trade. George, the eldest brother, decides to build a steam engine completely made of glass. After several years of work, he achieves his goal and is met with almost overnight success. The public is fascinated. This working engine accomplishes two things. It demonstrates the power of steam in an age where most machinery around people were powered by steam. And it also shows you what you could do with glass. These spinning, twisting, whirring engines were made of hundreds and sometimes thousands of pieces of flamework glass in a dizzying array of colors. Soon, every glassworker on the road had to have an engine of their own if they were at all to be successful, and some troupes had two or more. George was kept busy building more engines for his own shows and those of others. Up until this point, most glassworkers traveled and performed by themselves, but the Woodruffs start the trend of forming troupes. Their first troupe is the Bohemian Troupe of Fancy Glassblowers. Now, the Woodruffs were not Bohemian. They were American-born and had Scottish ancestry, but like Professors Owen and Matthew, they understood the power of good marketing. So by including Bohemian in their name, they associated themselves with the fine tradition of Bohemian fancy glassworking. Later troupes also proclaimed themselves Bohemian or Venetian, again attaching their names with these notable traditions of glassworking. The Woodruffs eventually separate to form their own troupes, and William, the youngest brother, travels around the East and the Midwest, seemingly stopping in every city from New York to Illinois to North Carolina. Charles, the middle brother, is the world traveler of the bunch. Not content to stay and demonstrate in the United States, in 1865, he and his wife launch into a 10-year international tour, which includes stops in South Africa, India, Myanmar, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, New Zealand, and Australia. He demonstrates glassmaking to kings, government officials, and of course, members of the public. These are a couple of the international newspaper advertisements for his shows. He brought lampworking demonstrations to a huge number of people who may have never seen this type of live glassmaking before. Charles concluded his tour in England, and then headed back to the United States to demonstrate alongside his brother George at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. World's fairs like these were another popular spot for itinerant glassworkers to demonstrate. Soon after the fair, though, Charles travels back to Australia and spends the rest of his life demonstrating in cities across that nation. Also at the Centennial Exhibition of 1876 is a woman who goes by the name Madame Nora. Nora's troupe of glassblowers, workers, and spinners demonstrate to crowds in Philadelphia to great success. While not the first woman in the itinerant glassworker business, Nora is very likely the first woman to lead her own troupe on tour. She was the business owner of this troupe. She's joined by her son, William Allen, and later her daughter-in-law, Ada Laura, and her second husband, Alfred Seabury, among a rotating cast of other glassworkers. Nora and her troupe demonstrate around the Northeast United States, particularly in Pennsylvania and New York. She has a soft spot for orphans, giving free shows to groups like the Home of the Friendless in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. She also displays her marketing savvy with advertisements that double as coupons, and those attendees who brought the coupons to the show received a discount on their admission price. Before I move on, I want to point out a familiar face in the central advertisement, William Woodruff. In his later years, William joins Nora's troupe, and he calls himself, let me see if I can get this right, the Glasso-Blowo-Presta-Twista-Digitator. Kind of like a supercalifragilistic thing going on there. So Nora's troupe, of course, traveled with several steam engines, most notably Columbia and Excelsior. Now, Excelsior is a regular working glass steam engine, seen in this photo without its steam component, but Columbia was actually a hand fire engine, which was said to be able to shoot a stream of water 15 feet into the distance. Quite the spectacular display. These are the only two large engines currently known to survive intact today. They've lived through at least 150 years of history and use. You can see them today on display in the Leitner Museum in St. Augustine, Florida. While Nora was not the first woman in the business, she certainly seems to have had an impact on those who followed. Women like Madame Louise and Madame J. Reith clearly took cues from Nora's advertisements and stylings when promoting their own demonstrations. In the late 1800s and the first several decades of the 1900s, audiences have more entertainment options to choose from. They're also becoming more mobile. They no longer need to rely on entertainers to travel to their hometown. While most troupes still spend much of their time on the road, some itinerant glassworkers find steady employment in fixed locations with guaranteed audiences. For example, in 1939, 15 glassworkers demonstrated at this pavilion at the New York World's Fair. Others demonstrated in department stores and smaller state fairs. And into this moment comes the Howell family of glassblowers. Robert Howell Sr., his wife Maud, his sons Robert Jr. and Lee, and his daughters Nona and Grace performed together as the Howell family of Bohemian glassblowers. Howell Sr. actually joined the trade after seeing a working glass steam engine at a state fair, abandoning his plans to go into the railroad industry, and he met his wife while demonstrating at another state fair. As they raised their children, they trained them how to lampwork so they can join the family business. Grace remembers sitting down at the torch as early as the age of 6. And I want to mention before I move on that the Howells have a connection to Madame Nora. When Nora retired, she gifted her steam engines, Excelsior and Columbia, to the Howells so that they could continue to include them in their shows. Grace, one of the Howell daughters, has a knack for self-promotion. She creates this bluebird of happiness, originally for the 1940 movie The Bluebird, starring Shirley Temple. She then sends 2 bluebirds to England for Princess Elizabeth's playhouse, which you can see here is actually the size of a regular cottage. She sends another to Mamie Eisenhower, and yet another to the Corning Museum of Glass. Today, this is the only piece of glass in our collection that we can definitively credit to an itinerant glassworker. Grace's siblings also continue on in the glass business. Robert Jr. and Lee both work for Dr. Robert Oppenheimer during World War II, blowing scientific glassware that's used in the development of the atomic bomb. Lee later teaches glassblowing at UCLA, and Robert returns to the family tradition of lampworking shows and demonstrates with his wife Marie. Nona marries into the Deacon lampworking family and demonstrates with her husband John. So by this point, we've reached the middle decades of the 1900s. Americans have access to radio, television, movies, cars, trains, planes, any number of entertainment and transportation options. They have so many things they can do inside of their house, outside of their house, the next town over, and they have even less need for entertainers like itinerant glassworkers to travel to them, like they had a century before. The elder Howells continue to tour the country, but focus on demonstrating for school groups and clubs, places with a ready-made audience. Robert, Nona, and their spouses settle down in Florida at tourist attractions. Other itinerant glassworkers establish themselves at amusement parks like Disney, department stores, and museums, among other locations. Grace, unlike her siblings, continues to travel for most of the year, but she follows her parents' example, demonstrating to school groups, Girl Scout and Boy Scout troops, and appearing on TV variety shows. For many years, she spends the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas performing as a lampworking Mrs. Santa Claus in New York City shop windows. Grace and her siblings are some of the last itinerant glassworkers, and for the most part, they and their contemporaries are more rooted in place than their predecessors. At the same time, some new lampworkers are coming on the scene who are distancing themselves from what was seen as an old tradition, dismissing the glassworkers that you might have seen at carnivals or in shopping malls. Even so, the itinerant glassworker tradition of demonstration lives on in many places, including right here in the Corning Museum of Glass, Disney, and many other museums and theme parks and attractions of this nature. When the Corning Museum of Glass opened in 1951, you could go next door to the Hall of Science and see a lampworking demonstration. And today you can see our talented flameworkers 7 days a week in the Innovation Center demonstrating the capabilities of glass. Happily, a number of contemporary flameworkers have been inspired by the tradition of itinerant glassworkers. Bandhu Dunham, who you will hear from later this evening, creates kinetic machines that are in part inspired by the working glass engines created by George Woodruff and others. You can see his engine, the Crystal Gem, on display in the Curious and Curiouser exhibition at the Rake-Howe Library, up for one more month, so don't miss it. Tyler Gordon, a recent graduate of UW-Madison, gained entry into New Glass Review with SCUFA, his self-contained, untethered flameworking apparatus. You can watch videos of Gordon using SCUFA everywhere from a public park to a kayak, bringing new meaning to mobile flameworking. His project was directly inspired by itinerant glassworkers, and he's also built a museum of itinerant craft, a trailer with pull-out displays and cabinets of old lampworking equipment. I hope to see more flameworkers connecting with and embracing this part of their history in the future, and that, in part, is what tonight is all about. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you very much for that round of applause for Rebecca Hopman. And right now, I would like to introduce Mr. David Sandidge. David. David comes from a long line of glassmakers, and David is going to make a pirate ship for you tonight. You can see an example of the ship right there in his hands, and he's going to make a variation on that for you right now. He'll be working for another half an hour, 40 minutes or so, as he spins this glass pirate ship. The technique that David uses is called glass stitching, or glass, let me make sure I get this right, glass loop stitch, or spun glass. And in many ways, as he works on his ship, you'll see it kind of looks like a crocheted texture. But unlike crocheting, where knots are actually tied in the threads, glass has a curious physical property, and that hot glass sticks to hot glass. So David exploits that quality of the glass sticking to itself by heating it up, again with a torch, using oxygen and propane, just like Eric used. We use propane in flame working rather than natural gas because propane has more BTUs per cubic foot. So it actually gives us a slightly hotter flame when we mix it with the oxygen. We're using about 10 parts oxygen to about 1 part propane. That's kind of the ratio. You can see that David heats the glass, and the glass begins to glow in orange. Now, everybody that lives in Corning knows that's because of the heat. The glass actually becomes honey-like in its texture, but it rapidly cools into the rigid state, and that gives the structure to the individual pieces that David makes. I mentioned that David started when he was 15. He learned from his brother. And also he shared with me today that his wife, his sister, and even his brother-in-law are all involved in the glass-making trades. So very much like the people that Rebecca called out in her fabulous talk, glass-making truly is a family affair very often, a tradition that's passed down from generation to generation to generation. You can see how David gently loop stitches or spins the glass into a disc, and this part that he's making now will eventually become the base of our ship. So how about a round of applause for David? He's going to continue working. You can watch this spectacle of molten glass unfold right before your very eyes. But we have a lot of ground to cover today, so we're going to move things right along. And as David continues to work, one other quick thing I wanted to tell you, the Corning Museum of Glass mobile hot shop will be going to the World Gathering, the Glass Art Society conference that's going to happen in St. Petersburg, Florida. And as luck would have it, we're lucky, and that David is going to be with us in St. Petersburg, Florida, and he's going to be presenting there as well. David sells his work all over the world, still doing it today, and David at one time worked for Disney. So again, Rebecca mentioned that in her talk, and this is living proof. So I would like to introduce to you Bandhu Dunham. Bandhu Dunham is an amazing practitioner of glass engineering, making exquisite sculpture and all kinds of engines and moving parts, feats of engineering that you would just think could not be done in glass. So if you would please welcome to the stage one of the teachers of flame working, teaches all over the world, teaches here in Corning, Bandhu Dunham.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to talk about some of my own glass work and how I got involved. As soon as we get the slides up. There we go. I'm going to talk about how I got involved in glass blowing. The Dr. Frankenstein image here will make more sense in a minute. When I was a kid, I was interested in chemistry. I had a chemistry lab in the basement. At those times, you could get chemistry sets, like the Gilbert sets. Some of you guys may remember those. And that's not me in the middle there. That's sort of an aspirational picture from one of the Gilbert books. But they had great manuals went with them, and there was a whole mystique around the chemistry lab. There were also some books available at the time. The Gilbert chemistry labs, the sets, would have a manual with them, and sometimes there'd be some glass blowing illustrated in there, a little bit about basic glass blowing. And then as a chemistry nerd, I also was able to find some other books. Though on the lower right there, the Boy's Book of Experiments, which is from the 1930s, was really great and had all kinds of wonderful, dangerous things for boys to do that you probably couldn't find in books that are being published now. Had how to make gunpowder, had how to make nitrocellulose, which is flash paper, how to make sulfuric acid, from common household ingredients. And however, the author refused to tell the boys how to make nitroglycerin because, in his words, he did not want to abet the undertaker. The Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments on the lower right, that was a really wonderful book that had all kinds of stuff and was very inspiring for young scientists. There was a story a few years ago in Harper's Magazine about a young man who had that book, and this book is from 1960, so he had an old copy. And in the book, it explained how glow-in-the-dark clock dials at that time were made with radium. So this young man decided he wanted to collect as much nuclear material as he could. And he went around to antique stores buying up old clocks that had glow-in-the-dark dials on them. And he was even lucky enough to find one that had a little bottle of touch-up glow-in-the-dark paint tucked into the cabinet of like a grandfather clock or something. He found some of these by going around with a Geiger counter near antique stores and seeing when it went off. So anyway, he got enough of this material that he made a small breeder reactor in the shed in his backyard, and it actually started producing increasing levels of radioactivity to the point where the federal government had to come in and declare his home a Superfund cleanup site. So that's the kind of great chemistry experiments you could do with some of those books that were available back then. It's a shame they're not available now, although I can think of some of the things that I dumped down the sink when I was a kid that were probably not so great. This is an illustration that was in one of the Gilbert chemistry manuals. It's actually the tools of a glass blower, and there is something about the mystique of this wood carving, this wood carved illustration that really intrigued me, and I think it was one of the things that really got me more interested in glass. Interestingly, when I wanted to use this illustration in one of my books, I contacted the Corning Museum because the credit line in the Gilbert manual listed the Corning Museum as the source for the image. So I was contacting the museum or the library for the rights to use it, and they said, we don't have that original anymore. It was lost in the flood in 1972, if you've seen that water level line out there. So the fact that I had it, probably not the only extant version of that illustration, but the fact that I had it and then reused it in a book, it sort of brought it back into circulation. So I was glad to be able to do that. And now that illustration is out there for people to see, and there's copies for the library to have. So as I said, I was interested in chemistry, but really what I wanted to be was a mad scientist. And I thought that if I learned to make more elaborate chemical apparatus, then I could really be a proper mad scientist. So I was able to find in our county library in New Jersey a couple of books on, there we go, oops, too far. A couple of books on glassblowing. In the center there you see Creative Glassblowing by James Hamasfar with illustrations by Claire Stong. That book was very influential and had some really great information. On the left there is some of James Hamasfar's work, very much in the tradition of the itinerant glassblowers making glass animals. And there's actually some video at the library, at the Raycow Library, of James Hamasfar doing some of the techniques from his book. It's really interesting and amusing to watch. Another book that was really influential that I found at our county library was Glass, hand-blown, sculptured, and colored by John Burton, who was a British television actor who took up glassblowing after seeing glassblowers, I think, at Orrefors in Sweden working at the furnace. And he decided to teach himself to learn to do lampworked glass. And basically, there wasn't anyone teaching him. He found some equipment and just invented his own technique. And his technique, which you can also see in some videos that are at the Raycow Library, his technique by modern standards is sort of funky, but he was so inspired about it. He was like, by Jove, I'm going to do this thing. And when you see his videos, he has this great, booming British voice. It's really great to watch him work. So he was very inspiring, and in his book, he had a whole section of inspirational quotes. So these two books were part of the reason I ended up doing books myself later. But I started teaching myself to blow glass when I was in high school. And here I am at a craft fair in 1979 with some of the little glass animals I was selling. And my assistant there is putting together some test tube babies. This was back when the first test tube baby was in the news all the time. So being an entrepreneur, I took some glass test tubes and put arms and legs on, and diapers on them, and a little instruction manual, kind of like a pet rock, and sold test tube babies for a while. And we were doing animals, as you can see there on the right, including the tree-eating Brontosaurus on the lower right. Then as my own work and career developed, I noticed that there really wasn't any books out conveying the more contemporary aspects of glassblowing, of lampwork glassblowing or flameworking. It had really evolved a lot since the time of Burton's and Hamasfar's books. So after the first lampworking class that they had at Pilchuck that I was a student in, discussing it with some of the other students and the instructors, it kind of landed in my lap that I was going to do a book on glassblowing, on lampwork technique. So I started doing some research through every book I could find, and then also came here to the Raycow Library and did a bunch of research here, and then started picking up additional information from various sources. In the upper right there, you can see the first edition of my book. I self-published the book, so on the middle right, you see us receiving some pallet loads of books that we were putting into storage near my studio, a couple of my assistants there, including Ian James, who was my teaching assistant last summer when I taught here at the studio. And now the books have evolved into the third edition, and there are 3 volumes in the set, which, for shameless self-promotion, will be available at a book signing here after our event tonight, and are also available in the museum bookstore on a regular basis. The middle image there is really interesting. That's a stereopticon image of a glass steam engine, and I think that might be from the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia. You might be able to get the 3D effect if you put your hand in front of your face and try to divide the image. It's a little tricky. You really need one of those stereopticon viewers. And then on the left are a couple other steam engines. Mr. A.O. Scott in 1937, I think, made that steam engine as a birthday present for his grandson, who is one of the Manley brothers, who were glass blowers. And then in the middle left is that image of Mr. Backman with his steam engine on the right. And then on the left is a bottle imp, which you saw in some of the video that Rebecca was showing, but also I brought a couple of bottle imps here that people can play with later. You can see the idea when you squeeze it. This one doesn't have a rubber or goat bladder or anything on the top. It's got a squeezable bottle. People can play with this later if you have the thumb strength. I also brought some other samples and components of pieces that I work with over here that people can play with when we're all done. And then below the lower right, that's a close-up image of the Excelsior, which I went to visit and check out when I was trying to figure out how to make a steam engine of my own. So I've got a little video here that shows some of my, the development of my glass machines. Oops, sorry, wait, there we go. Yes, we're right. Good, click, go. There we go. The resolution on some of the images is a little rough here, but I think you can figure out what's going on. So this is the first steam engine I tried. I think it may still be in a box over at the studio because this was made here. It's very funky. It's more like a mousetrap game than a working engine. I really had no idea what I was doing. Then came a lot of research. That's the Excelsior. And this is the first engine that I made after seeing that. It was very much a Dr. Frankenstein moment. So when this thing started turning over and kept going, it was like, I was shouting, "It's alive! It's alive!" I had to try a lot of different things to figure out the right gasket material. The Excelsior was actually, the gaskets were actually string wrapped around the glass and I think maybe soaked with grease or something. But here's some of the different gasket materials I tried with notes underneath them, sometimes with swear words underneath them, of why it did or did not work. So this is the first engine I made that works, and it still runs to this day. Every now and then I pull it out and put it together. An interesting historical note that the expression balls out refers to the governor, which when it's spinning at full speed, the balls are out all the way, and then when they drop down at lower speeds. The real McCoy is an expression that comes from steam engines also. The steam engine valve by the McCoy company was the one that was good, with many imitators that were inferior. So if you were buying a steam engine valve, you wanted the real McCoy. This steam engine's in a private collection now somewhere in Massachusetts. So the crystal gem was designed to run on compressed air, but for display purposes, here it is running on air, but for display purposes at the library, it's running connected to a motor. Just makes it easier to run. I've tried all kinds of complicated, crazy elevator mechanisms on the marble machines. I think this is the most complicated one I ever did. It's the first one. I've learned to make things simpler. This is a double stair step. This has an Archimedes screw. This one has excuse me, the angel is going to come over and kiss the devil, but she just kisses him on the nose because he is a devil after all. So that's some of the development of my kinetic pieces. One of the things I like about the kinetic glass is the degree of audience engagement that's created by the kinetic sculpture, and especially if it's participatory, where you can turn the crank yourself and play with it. So there's an emotional investment that happens. There's a level of drama and buy-in. This is a piece I did when I was teaching down in Australia a few years ago. It's a fairly simple mechanism, double crank, but because things are connected to it in different ways, you get a lot of motion. This actually became the prototype for a commission I did last year, a swimming fish. Kinetic sculpture also, I feel like it shares, it's a way of sharing the creative process with the spectator. So when we're working glass, you know, we're spinning the glass, we're rotating it, there's heat, the way the light plays on the glass as it's moving, all those things, you know, we experience as glass workers really close up. I mean, you can see it from a distance, but when you have something like a steam engine, you have a lot of the same elements. You have the rotation, the play of light on the glass, that element of heat and danger. So to me, it's kind of a fun way of sharing the experience of working glass a little bit. This is one of my marble machines. It has a chain-driven elevator mechanism. This is in the collection of the Sandwich Glass Museum. Oh, sorry to mention the competition. But anyway, it's there to be seen if you want, out on Cape Cod. This has a switch in it. You might notice as the marbles come out the top, they hit a switch in the upper left right there, and there's two different tracks that the marbles come down, and the switch makes the marbles alternate between the tracks. And I have that mechanism here in one of these samples in front. So a lot of the parts I use in the marble machines, I have a prototype that I keep around as a reference, so I don't have to remember how I made it each time. I have a reference. So there's one of those switches there that you can check out later. Yeah, after we're done tonight with the demos and things around 8 o'clock, if people want to play with some of these machines for a little while, we can do that. All right. many of my kinetic pieces, like Kyle here, the name is an acronym, so Kyle stands for Keep Your Life Exciting. I also like making different kinds of automata. You saw the devil and the angel. So they're just a fun way of working sort of spontaneously and taking a simple mechanism and making something more elaborate out of it. So this one's called A Spot of Tea. It has a fairly simple crank slide mechanism, but because there's a slot in the crank, in the linkage, it gives it that dwell at the bottom, like the actual motion of pouring tea. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the technical aspects of how I make the pieces, then I'll also demonstrate a little bit of it. So I worked out my own assembly system for some of the parts and also using different kinds of jigs, some of which I've had to make myself because they're not something that's commonly available. So here I'm using some clamps that are used typically for making like a picture frame. You could get those at the hardware store, but I can just adapt those since they're metal. I can adapt them to working glass. So those are some jigs that I can get, existing things, some things I've had to make myself. Here is a assembly technique that I developed, and I'll be making some of the parts for a crankshaft here a little bit later, where there's a bearing, which is, if you look in the upper left there, that white plastic bearing is what keeps the glass from scratching against itself, because when glass scratches, it becomes much weaker. So you need some kind of bearing or lubrication in between. So I have a system here where on the throw arm of that crank has two little grooves in it. So what happens here on the upper left, you see the exploded view. In the lower left, you can see that one of the O-rings has been put into position, and it's sitting in a groove. The bearing has been slid up against that. That C-shaped linkage has been slipped partway onto that bearing, and then the other O-ring is going to be slid in place. So if you look on the right, you can see it all put together, and the two O-rings hold that linkage in place so that it can rotate around the crank but not slip side to side. Here's one of the jigs I had to fabricate myself from scratch, just from a graphite block and like a router bit on there, or really a burr, using it like a router bit, and carving a grid onto the groovy marver. I call that the groovy marver because it has grooves in it. It's also used for making grooves. I'll work with that a little bit later. That's one I made myself. This is one I had made for me by a company that does CAD carving. They made the spiral that I then use a ribbon burner to gently heat a glass rod and wrap it around that. And you can see in the lower right the finished form. And a marble would go in that and spin. You may have seen that, notice that on the Kyle marble machine. There was one of these spirals where the marble goes in and runs around. This is a project I did about a year ago called Ganesha, which was made for a gallery in Sedona, Arizona. They had this existing feature, which you can see in the picture on the left, these sort of curving pipes on the front of the gallery, and they wanted me to come up with a kinetic piece to go in there. So I came up with a giant marble machine, which you can see on the right in the computer rendering that I had to learn the software to do the computer rendering, and worked with a metal fabricator from Phoenix to put it together. And here's an installation shot. You can see Sedona is a lovely setting. And here Ryan Murray, who was the metal fabricator and a designer in his own right, we worked together to install it over a period of about a week. And here's the piece, the thumbnails here are sideways, but it'll turn right side up when I run them. You can see the piece running during the day. So the marbles, which are about 2 1/8 inch diameter, that are glass that I made, run through, and they turn. Some of these rondelles will spin when the marbles hit the mechanism behind them. And then some of the rondelles aren't actually spinning, but when traffic goes by, the reflection, like right there, the reflection actually looks like it's spinning. So it's kind of an interesting effect I hadn't really anticipated when I was designing it. And then on the right, you can see it at night. There's UV lighting on it, and then some of the marbles have uranium glass and other colors that react with ultraviolet light to glow. So they kind of perk up and glow at different points when they go by the ultraviolet light. So that's a piece I did about a year ago. The client actually wants us to do some more work on it, add some pieces to it. So we'll be doing that hopefully later this year. And here's a view from behind, sort of inside. You can see some of the mechanisms going around. Again, this has a Archimedes screw for the elevator. It was a real challenge to try and design something around this existing structure. It took me a couple of years just to wrap my head around it and decide that I actually had to learn the 3D software. And this is an example of this new series I've been working on for a little while, the Fred marble machines. They're sort of a compact marble machine. In fact, I have one here that people can play with later. And there's a little video of it here. The video is a bit squashed, but you can get the idea. It has only 3 moving parts aside from the marbles, but it creates a lot of sense of motion with a minimal amount of parts. So that's one of the things I like about it. And then this is a project we did last year when I was teaching at the Penland School down in North Carolina, Penland School of Crafts. We did a collaborative Rube Goldberg machine. I'd done one of those about 10 years ago, and then we did it again last year, where each of the students in the class had a section about 18 inches square, and they had to make a piece that was part of a continuous chain of motion. And then they were all linked together, and this is about halfway through the piece when we were demonstrating it for the school at their closing event. You can sort of see how it works here. And then right now I have some work at an exhibit called Kinetic Energy. It's part of a group show of kinetic sculptures at the Museum of Neon Art in Los Angeles. So this is that engine that was shown in that earlier video that had really crappy resolution. Here's a little bit better resolution of that image. All right, well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Bandhu Dunham. Bandhu is going to take his position here on our stage, and he's going to do a little demo for you. In the meantime, we're going to check in with David over here, and I told you that you'd be wowed and amazed. David's been busily working away, spinning or loop stitching that piece together, and you can see the mass of the ship are beginning to take shape. I can see the base in the hull. I think you can probably all see it out there as well. If you look up on our cameras, you can get a little bit closer view. You can see how that glass stretches when it's just the right temperature. All right, so we're going to continue to watch David as he works on our pirate ship. And Bandhu's going to do a little demo for us.
Okay. Is this mic working? There we go. Good. So the first little demo I'm going to do is going to be a steam-powered magnifying glass. We've been talking about steam engines and other things. The first steam engines actually didn't use the pushing of the steam. They used suction by filling a piston with steam, a cylinder with steam, pushing the piston out, and then they would cool it, and the contracting steam would pull on the piston. It actually drove a pump that was, the first steam engines were used for pulling water out of coal mines, pumping water out. So this is, so in effect, what was being used wasn't the pressure of the steam, but rather the pressure of the atmosphere. And we're going to use the pressure of the atmosphere here to make a magnifying glass. And this is one of those experiments that was in the Gilbert chemistry sets, and similar books. So what I did, we're doing this a little bit like a cooking show. I made the bubbles ahead. You've probably seen people blowing glass bubbles somewhere in the museum if you've ever been here. So I blew this bubble. The end down here is open. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to heat the bubble, warm up the air inside without getting the bubble itself soft. So I'm just going to warm up the air. The air will expand. As the air expands, becomes less dense, pushes some air out, then it's going to start to cool. And as it cools, the air is going to contract and create a partial vacuum. I'm going to use that vacuum to suck some water into this bulb, into the bubble. So there'll be some air and a little bit of water in there. Then I'm going to boil that water. The water will turn to steam. The steam will displace the air, so there'll be pretty much nothing but water vapor in there. When that water vapor condenses, it's going to create a tighter vacuum. And I'm going to dip this into the water. It's going to suck water in and fill this up. And the water will actually act as a magnifying glass. So it takes a moment to warm it up here. But when the water goes in at the very last step, you'll see it actually goes in pretty quickly. So let's see, is this in a good position for the cameras? Yeah, there we go, good. You can see what they got. So I'm just warming this up right now to make the air expand. Then I'm going to dip this down in here, and as it cools, it's going to draw a little bit of water. In fact, maybe I'll help it cool a little bit. There we go, yeah, I got it probably pretty warm there. Is it drawing in some water? Yeah, it's drawing in some water. Now, I'm going to pull this up and point it not at anyone. You can imagine some kid pointing it at his little brother accidentally from one of those old chemistry sets. You don't want to do that. Don't do that at home. Shoot steam it anyway. So now the water that's in here is boiled. There's a little bit left, but it's displaced most of the air. Now I'm going to stick this back in, and as this cools off, it draws in the water and pulled it all the way, nearly all the way up to the top. So at this point, actually, you know what? I want to do this a little bit more. I want to draw just a little bit more water into here if I can. See if it'll work. Yeah, it's drawing a little bit in, but we'll just finish this up. So what I'm going to do now is let this cool and close off the end. But again, because this is like a cooking show, I've got one here I did a little bit earlier. So there it is. Ta-da! Anyone remember the Galloping Gourmet? Ever used to watch him on TV? He used to do that all the time, except he'd have different, it would come out of the oven, it would be a different colored dish, you know. So now I'm going to finish sealing the top of this off, or what's the bottom of the handle. Let that cool just a little bit more. But you can see, I don't know if we can magnify something here. I don't know if the focal length is anything that the cameras can pick up. We could pass this around later. People can play with this. That's the steam-powered magnifying glass.
All right, thank you, everybody. The crown prince of glass engineering, Bandhu Dunham. And you can see that our friend David is still busy. David still makes glass every day. That's how he makes his living. His glass is widely exhibited and sold around the world. He travels around the globe. And now we have 1, 2, and I think we're going to bring up another one of our glass makers, Caitlin Hyde. Caitlin Hyde is our team leader here at the Corning Museum of Glass. She makes glass animals every day. She's made a veritable glass menagerie of animals over the years. And normally when Caitlin works here at the Corning Museum, you'll see her working at the torch diligently. And she will make the glass animals out of solid Pyrex glass. Today, she's going to be using Pyrex glass tubing, and she's going to be making a little pig for us today. But instead of being solid glass, it's going to be hollow. So Caitlin has done all kinds of glass sculpture. I've seen her work on a multitude of different projects, everything from pieces and demonstrations that were part of the repertoire of the Blaschkas, the people from the Czech Republic that made the fabulous biological sculptures for study at various universities and scientific programs. You can see again she's using the torch. She's constantly rotating. That's a hollow tube that she has, and that eventually will become the body of our glass pig. And we're going to move things along here a little bit. I'm going to also ask Eric Goldschmidt to return to the stage. And now, not a 3-ring circus, but a 4-ring circus of our grand Bohemian Troupe of fancy glass blowers. How about a round of applause? It's not often you're going to see that. Now, I told you that we're only going to do this here one time, one show only, and that's the truth. But we've had so much fun doing this that we think it might be fun to do it again sometime, maybe somewhere else, and spread the good word about Corning. Now, Eric has studied flame working for many years now. He's also a glass blower. He's the supervisor of our flame working demonstrations. And Eric is going to make some hollow glass animals, very much in the Bohemian style. You would have seen this type of work done in the Czech Republic or in East Germany. In fact, they're still doing it there today. You might have a glass bird on your holiday tree that's made out of glass and has long glass threads for a tail. And that's exactly the way those pieces are made. In fact, Eric has made a couple of nice examples right here, and you can see the threaded glass tail. Remember when he was winding the drum and making those threads? That's how they make the bird's tail. So now we have our entire troupe working along, and we're going to continue to work along, but it's a school night, so we want to give everybody a chance that needs to move along, a chance to leave if you'd like to leave, but we'd love to have you stay. We're going to be here. We'd love to have you talk with us. I have a couple of little announcements here that I want to make right at the very end. And we certainly hope that you've enjoyed our show this evening. It's a rare treat to mix history and live glass blowing together. We did promise free gifts to all of our young people that came, and I don't know if you saw the mysterious bags over here, but we do have free gifts for all of our young people in the audience today. We want to invite you to come and see the show, Curious and Curiouser, at the Rakow Library. It's up for another month. Bandhu Dunham will be signing his books following our demos today. And also, Eric Goldschmidt, I know, has some flame working CDs as well that are available. So we'd like to give a huge round of applause and a big thanks. Look at the flames. I love it. Still captivating today. I can understand these itinerant glass makers wandering the globe, amazing people with the technology and artistry that they have. And it's still just as mesmerizing today. I know sometimes when we're working here at the Hot Glass Show or maybe off-site somewhere, it's kind of like moths to a flame. And I've been working here for a long, long time, been watching glassmaking for a long, long time, and I'm still captivated and amazed by this mystical and magic material. So we're going to invite our people that have some children with them. We're going to come over. You can come over here, and we'll get you a glass animal. I have some friends over here. Chris can maybe help me hand out some of these glass animals. I know she's right there on hand. And our glass makers are going to continue to work for a little while, so you're welcome to sit and enjoy it. Or if you want to, come up a little closer. And I'll be here to talk with everybody. Rebecca will be here to talk. And once again, thank you all so very much for attending. Please have your child pick up a glass animal. And a big round of applause for the Grand Bohemian Troupe of fancy glass blowers. Thank you, everybody.
think it was good with the. I'm gonna turn this off.